When I got the call from Eric, it was almost 2 a.m., and his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Cracked, panicked, practically begging me to come find him. He was muttering something about being trapped at a place called Deep Pine Asylum, and though I'd never heard of it before, he insisted it was nearby, hidden somewhere in the same mountain town where we'd grown up. I tried to press him for details, to ask how he'd ended up there or why he couldn't just leave on his own, but he wouldn't answer me directly. His words were fragmented, something about shadows moving, they're watching, and a doctor who wouldn't let him leave. He was breathing heavily, talking so fast I could barely understand him, and right before the line cut out, I heard him whisper, "You're my only hope. Please just come." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with a dread that felt all too real, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't just leave him there. Eric had always been the stable one between us, the rational one. If he was that afraid, it meant something truly horrifying was happening. So without hesitating, I threw on my jacket, grabbed my car keys, and drove through the darkness to find him, the winding mountain roads feeling eerily empty as I made my way toward a place I'd never seen yet somehow felt like I'd known forever. The directions he'd given were vague, but I eventually found an old, rusted gate hidden behind a thicket of trees, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. Deep Pine Asylum was barely legible on the decrepit sign hanging by a single rusted chain, the letters faded and peeling as if they hadn't been touched in decades. But as I parked the car and stepped out into the chill of the early morning air, I noticed something strange. The building itself was massive and looming, its stone walls cracked and weathered, yet somehow lights were flickering in the windows, casting eerie shadows across the empty grounds. The front doors creaked open as I approached, almost as if the place was expecting me, and the moment I stepped inside, a security guard appeared from the shadows. He was pale, almost sickly looking, his eyes unfocused as if he hadn't truly slept in days. Without even asking who I was or why I'd come, he raised a trembling finger, pointing down a long, dimly lit corridor that led to the east wing, and muttered, "They don't like it when you linger." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to push forward, telling myself this was all just a rundown hospital and that maybe I'd find Eric somewhere down those endless, flickering hallways. As I walked deeper into the asylum, though, the unsettling feeling only grew, the air growing colder with each step, and I started to notice strange symbols carved into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, almost ancient-looking, twisted shapes that seemed to follow me no matter where I turned. Occasionally, I'd pass by what looked like old patient rooms, the doors shut tight, but from inside, I could hear muffled voices, soft sobbing, and a frantic scratching sound like someone clawing at the walls. Every time I thought about stopping, about opening one of those doors to see if Eric was inside, something in me froze, a primal instinct warning me that whatever was behind those doors wasn't something I wanted to see. Eventually, I stumbled upon an office with a tarnished plaque that read, "Dr. Levi," in faded letters, and inside, I found what looked like relics from a nightmare. The room was filled with bizarre items: a half-burned notebook, a pair of shackles crusted with rust and what looked disturbingly like dried blood, and most unsettling of all, a series of yellowed photographs scattered across the desk, each one showing patients with wide, unnatural smiles, their eyes gouged out yet somehow still seeming to stare back at me. My blood ran cold as I recognized Eric in one of the photos, his face ashen, his eyes black and vacant, his lips twisted into a smile that wasn't his own. I wanted to turn and run, but something made me keep going, a pull I couldn't quite explain, as if leaving now would somehow be worse than staying. I pocketed the photo, needing proof that he was here, that I wasn't just losing my mind. Deeper into the asylum, I finally found him in a padded room, slumped against the wall with his head buried in his hands, muttering about the depths and the doctor. When he looked up and saw me, he looked almost relieved, though his eyes darted around like he was expecting something to appear at any moment. He told me that he'd been lured here by voices, whispers in his mind promising answers to questions he didn't even know he had, and that once he arrived, he couldn't leave. "The doctor," he whispered. "He's still here watching us all. He can see things we can't." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and his eyes filled with a terror I'd never seen before as he told me, "We need to wait for a signal. If we leave before that, he'll know." His words didn't make sense, but the desperation in his voice made me hesitate, and I knew that whatever was happening here, it was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. Just as I was about to insist we leave, the air around us shifted, a chill sweeping through the room, and from somewhere down the hall, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps, heavy, measured, as if something massive was moving toward us. Eric's face went pale, and he yanked me into a nearby closet. His hand clamped over my mouth as we both listened to the footsteps drawing closer, each one echoing through the empty corridors like the toll of a death bell. I barely dared to breathe as I caught a glimpse through a crack in the door of a shadow moving past. A figure so large it seemed to fill the entire hallway, dragging something behind it that scraped against the floor with a sound that set my teeth on edge. Eric's voice was barely a whisper as he muttered, "That's him, the doctor. He's not human. If he finds us, something worse than death will be done to us." I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself that maybe it was just a deranged patient or someone playing a twisted prank. But deep down, I knew that whatever was out there wasn't anything I could rationalize. When the footsteps finally faded, we crept out of the closet and bolted, desperately searching for a way out. But every hallway twisted and turned back on itself, leading us deeper into the asylum rather than toward an exit. It was as if the building itself was alive, guiding us, trapping us in its depths. Eventually, we somehow found ourselves in a stone chamber beneath the asylum, a room that looked older than the building itself, filled with strange artifacts and murals depicting twisted rituals and unspeakable acts. At the center of the room was a crumbling altar, and on it lay a blade and a piece of parchment with a single, horrifying message. To seal the passage, a life must be given willingly. Eric looked at me, his face hollow, and I saw in his eyes a resignation that broke me. He knew what had to be done. His voice was barely a whisper as he said, "If it's the only way, then do it. End this. Stop whatever's here." My heart shattered as I realized what he was asking me to do, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But as the shadows around us thickened and the faint sound of footsteps began again, I knew we didn't have a choice. My hands trembled as I stared at the message on the crumbling parchment, my mind racing to find another way. Any way out of this nightmare that wouldn't cost a life. But when I turned to Eric, he was already watching me with a look I couldn't quite place. A strange mix of fear and calm, as if he'd known all along this moment would come. He took a shaky breath, his eyes glancing around the chamber with an odd acceptance before he whispered, "It has to be me. You know that, right? It's the only way to close this place, to end whatever's here." I shook my head, my mind rejecting what he was saying even as part of me knew he was right. "No, there has to be another way, Eric, something we haven't thought of. We can find it together. We just have to keep looking. Maybe there's another exit, or..." I trailed off, knowing the words sounded hollow, but I couldn't bring myself to accept what he was asking. Eric placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm despite the exhaustion in his face, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think you understand. This place has us. It knows we're here, and if one of us doesn't stay behind, it'll never let either of us go. You have to let me do this." He looked at me with a calm determination, his gaze piercing, and I could see that he meant it, that he'd already made up his mind. Still, I couldn't accept it. I couldn't just agree to something so final. My voice cracked as I pleaded with him. "But you don't know what'll happen, Eric. There's no guarantee this will even work. I can't be the one to... I can't." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, the weight of the moment crushing me. But Eric only shook his head, his voice steady, resolved. "If you don't, then we both die here. Don't you see that? I'd rather know that at least one of us made it out, that at least one of us survived this place." He took a deep breath, his voice softening as he added, "Please, I'd do the same for you if our roles were reversed." He looked away for a moment, almost as if he were gathering the last of his strength, then met my eyes again. "You know what you have to do." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, filling the space around us with a dread I couldn't shake. And in that moment, I felt my resolve weaken, the hopelessness of our situation pressing down on me like an unseen force. My hands shook as I reached out, barely able to look at him as I felt the full weight of what I was about to do, my vision blurring with tears. The room seemed to grow colder, darker, as if the asylum itself were watching, waiting for the moment to arrive. I could barely breathe as I held my trembling hands out, the flickering light casting long shadows across Eric's face. He watched me with a strange calm, a hint of sorrow in his eyes, but also something almost reassuring, like he was willing me to go through with it, as if his acceptance alone could make it easier for me. The ritual chamber around us seemed to hum with an energy that made my skin prickle, as if the very walls were alive and pressing in, hungry to consume what would happen next. Eric squeezed my shoulder one last time, his voice barely a murmur. "You have to be strong, man, for both of us." His words felt heavy, sinking into me like stones, dragging me deeper into a reality I wanted so desperately to reject. "Just think of it as the only way out, all right?" He tried to offer a faint smile, but his lips barely moved, the effort draining him. I could see how pale he'd become, shadows under his eyes, and I knew he was just as terrified as I was. But he wouldn't let it show, wouldn't break down, not when he knew I was about to shatter. I kept thinking maybe he'd change his mind, that at the last second he'd pull away and tell me to run, that he couldn't go through with it. But he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, taking a step back into the dark center of the chamber, his figure swallowed up by the shadows around him, his breath shallow but even. I felt the weight of the air pressing down, heavy and thick, as if something in this place was holding its breath, waiting. Each second dragged on, and I became acutely aware of every tiny detail, the low hum in the air, the slight tremor in Eric's hands, the weight of his stare as he looked at me one last time with an expression I could barely stand to see. It was the look of someone who knew they were saying goodbye, and it made my chest ache, my stomach twist in knots. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, my vision blurring as I blinked back tears, forcing myself to focus, to be strong, if only for him. Just close your eyes," he whispered, his voice shaking now, betraying the fear he'd tried so hard to hide. I nodded, and he looked away, his hands clenching into fists as he braced himself. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum, louder and louder, filling the silence between us. I raised the blade from the altar, my hands trembling so violently I was afraid I'd drop it. I forced myself to steady my grip, breathing hard as I tried to summon the courage to go through with it, my whole body screaming against the act, every fiber of my being rejecting what I was about to do. But then, through the haze of fear and despair, I saw him close his eyes, a final gesture of acceptance, as if giving me his permission to finish what we'd started. I moved forward, my steps slow and deliberate, each one feeling like a betrayal, like a weight dragging me down deeper into a place I could never escape. As I stood before him, the air around us seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching and twisting as if they were alive, eager for the sacrifice that was about to be made. I closed my eyes for a moment, steeling myself, my hand tightening around the blade, and in that instant, I could swear I felt something brush against my skin, something cold and unnatural, as if the darkness itself had come alive, reaching out, waiting for its prize. Eric's breathing was shallow now, his chest rising and falling with each slow, steady breath, and I knew he was as afraid as I was, if not more. But he didn't flinch, didn't try to pull away. He just stood there, waiting, resigned, and I knew he was holding on, that he was doing this for me, that he was sacrificing himself so that I could live. The thought sent a wave of anguish through me, a sharp, searing pain that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. My grip tightened, and for a brief, agonizing moment, I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn around and run, to find another way. But deep down, I knew there was no other way, that this was the only chance we had, and that if I didn't go through with it, we'd both be lost in this place forever. I forced myself to move, my arm feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds as I raised the blade, each movement slow and deliberate, as if time itself had slowed down, dragging out the moment, stretching it into an eternity. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, his eyes still closed, his face calm, almost peaceful, and it broke something inside me to know that he'd accepted this, that he was ready to die so that I could live. My heart ached, my chest felt tight, and my hands shook, my vision blurring as I fought to keep my emotions in check, to do what had to be done. I could hear the faintest whisper of something in the air around us, a low, haunting sound that sent a shiver down my spine, like the voices of the countless souls who'd been trapped here before us, waiting for release. And I knew that whatever darkness lurked in this place, it was watching, waiting, eager for the sacrifice that would finally set it free. As the blade descended, I felt a surge of despair, a wave of guilt and horror that threatened to consume me, but I forced myself to push through, to go through with it, my vision swimming as I tried to focus, to block out the pain, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss. I could feel the life slipping from him, the energy in the room shifting, the darkness around us growing thicker, more oppressive, as if it were feeding off the act, drawing strength from the sacrifice. And as the last breath left his body, I felt a surge of power, a burst of energy that seemed to ripple through the air, filling the chamber with a palpable sense of release, as if the very walls were exhaling, releasing a breath they'd been holding for centuries. But instead of relief, instead of the sense of freedom I'd hoped for, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me, a chill that seeped into my bones, a sense that something was very, very wrong. The darkness around me seemed to shift, to come alive, swirling and writhing, as if it had been waiting, as if it had only been held back by the life that had just been taken. And in that moment, I realized with a sickening certainty that we'd been wrong, that the ritual hadn't freed us, that it had only opened the door for something far worse, something that had been waiting in the shadows all along, biding its time, waiting for the moment it could finally break free. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the darkness began to coalesce, taking shape, forming into something that defied all reason, all comprehension. It was vast, a presence that seemed to fill the entire chamber, a being of pure darkness and malice, its form shifting and twisting, eyes like burning embers watching me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I felt the weight of its gaze, the cold, unrelenting force of its will pressing down on me, and I knew that whatever it wasn't bound by the same rules, the same limits as anything I'd ever known. This was something ancient, something that had existed long before us, and it had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to finally break free. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors as I sprinted through the asylum, my heart pounding, my mind racing, the weight of what I'd just done pressing down on me, a heavy, suffocating guilt that threatened to swallow me whole. I could feel it behind me, its presence filling the air, pressing in on me from all sides, an inescapable force that seemed to bleed into every corner of the building, wrapping around me like a shroud. I ran faster, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps, my vision blurring as I stumbled through the maze of hallways, desperate to escape, to put as much distance between myself and that room, that ritual as possible. I stumbled through the endless halls, my mind racing with images of what I had done, of Eric's last moments, and of the monstrous entity that seemed to pulse in the shadows, growing stronger with each passing second. The asylum seemed to shift around me, doors and corridors twisting into a labyrinth that was determined to keep me trapped. My breathing was ragged, and every corner I turned brought me face to face with a dead end or another corridor that stretched on endlessly. Panic clawed at me, the walls seeming to press closer, narrowing, as if the asylum itself were alive, trying to swallow me whole. But then, through the haze of fear and disorientation, I spotted a faint glimmer of moonlight, spilling across the floor just ahead. Summoning every ounce of strength, I lurched toward it, desperate, half stumbling and nearly collapsing as I ran. My hand found a heavy metal door, and I wrenched it open, the hinges groaning as if in protest, as though even the asylum itself didn't want to release me. I pushed through, feeling the cool air of the outside finally against my face. The night was dark and silent, an eerie calm after the horror I just left behind. I forced myself forward, each step a struggle as I fought against the weight of exhaustion and the crushing guilt of what I'd done. As I reached the grounds beyond the asylum, I risked one last look back, seeing the dark silhouette of the building looming behind me, its empty windows like eyes watching. But there was something else too, a darkness within those windows, a shadow that seemed to pulse, as if alive, watching me, knowing that no distance I put between us would ever be enough. The weight of it settled over me like a shroud, a haunting certainty that this wasn't over, that it would follow me, haunt me, that what I'd unleashed could never truly be escaped.